My sister laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. "You were never a real soldier," she said in front of our entire family. The room filled with awkward smiles. Nobody defended me. Nobody corrected her. For years, I'd avoided talking about my military past. I never wore medals, never told stories, never tried to impress anyone. Sarah thought my silence meant I had nothing to show. Then my mother reached into an old storage box and found a single photograph. The second that picture touched the table, the laughter stopped. And suddenly, everyone wanted answers. My name is Rachel Daniels, and I was 36 years old when my sister laughed at me in front of our entire family and told everyone I had never been a real soldier. The strange thing is, that wasn't the part that hurt. What hurt was that nobody seemed surprised she said it. The gathering was supposed to be a happy one. Dad had finally retired after 38 years working for the city, and Mom wanted the whole family together to celebrate. My parents' house was packed that Saturday afternoon. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. The backyard was filled with folding tables, barbecue smoke, and conversations that blended together into one long wall of noise. For most people, it was a celebration. For me, it felt like every family gathering we'd ever had. And that usually meant Sarah becoming the center of attention. My younger sister had always been the loud one, the confident one, the one who could walk into a room and somehow make every conversation about herself within 5 minutes. Sarah loved attention. She loved praise. She loved being admired. And, to be fair, she had built a successful life. She worked in corporate marketing, drove a luxury SUV, and documented nearly every moment of her life online. If someone had only looked at her social media accounts, they would have assumed she was the most accomplished person in the family. Meanwhile, I preferred a quieter life. After leaving military service years earlier, I worked in logistics management and lived comfortably without much need for recognition. I never posted accomplishments online. I never talked much about my past. And I definitely never discussed my years in uniform. Not because I was ashamed, because I simply didn't think they needed to be discussed. To me, those years were personal, meaningful, private. Apparently, Sarah viewed that silence very differently. The trouble started after dinner. A few relatives were sharing career stories around the patio table. One cousin talked about law school. Another discussed launching a small business. Then Sarah started listing her latest achievements. Her recent promotion, a speaking event, a business conference, a magazine feature. Everyone listened politely. Some genuinely impressed. Others simply used to it. Then Aunt Linda smiled and looked toward me. "Rachel, what about you? You've always had the most interesting stories." I immediately shook my head. "Not really." "Oh, come on," she laughed. "You spent years in the military." I should have known that would trigger Sarah. She rolled her eyes dramatically. Military. The way she said the word immediately changed the atmosphere. I felt several relatives glance toward her. Sarah leaned back in her chair. "You make it sound like Rachel was some decorated war hero." A few people chuckled nervously. I remained silent. Mom looked uncomfortable. Dad quietly sipped his coffee. Sarah wasn't finished. Honestly, nobody even knows what she actually did. Her smile widened. Half the time I wonder if she was ever really a soldier at all. The table went quiet. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me, waiting, watching, expecting some kind of response. I could have corrected her. I could have explained. Instead, I simply took a sip of water. That seemed to encourage her. "There it is," Sarah said. "See? That's exactly what I mean." She pointed toward me. "Real soldiers tell stories." A few people shifted awkwardly. Sarah continued. "Rachel never talks about anything." Her grin grew wider. "Maybe, because there isn't anything to talk about." The laughter started. Not cruel laughter. Not malicious. Just uncomfortable laughter from people unsure how to react. But it still stung. Sarah shook her head. "I swear, sometimes I think she just likes letting people assume things." Then she delivered the line she would regret for years. "You were never a soldier." She laughed. "You just like people thinking you were." For a moment, nobody spoke. Even Sarah seemed pleased with how dramatic the silence felt. Mom finally stood up. That's enough. Sarah shrugged. What? I'm joking. But nobody seemed amused anymore. To break the tension, Mom walked toward the garage. I think I still have some old family albums stored away. Dad nodded. Probably in the attic boxes. Several relatives welcomed the distraction. Within minutes, old storage containers were being carried into the living room. Dust-covered boxes. Photo albums. Stacks of forgotten memories. Everyone gathered around. The conversation slowly shifted away from Sarah's comments. At least for a while. Then Mom opened a faded cardboard box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were old letters, documents, photographs. She began sorting through them. Suddenly, she stopped. Her expression changed. What is it? Dad asked. Mom carefully lifted a photograph from the bottom of the box. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she looked at me, a look of surprise crossing her face. The room grew quiet again. Even Sarah stopped smiling. Slowly, Mom walked back to the table. Without saying a word, she placed the photograph in the center. And for the first time all afternoon, every single person in the room leaned forward to look. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Everyone simply stared at the photograph lying in the center of the table. Even from where I was sitting, I already knew which picture Mom had found. I hadn't seen it in years. Sarah leaned forward first. What is it? Mom slowly turned the photograph so everyone could see it clearly. The laughter disappeared instantly. The image showed me standing in uniform during a formal military ceremony. I wasn't alone. Several senior officers stood beside me. An American flag filled the background. A recognition plaque was visible in my hands. The picture had clearly been taken at an official event. Sarah blinked, then frowned. Okay. Nobody answered. Dad picked up the photograph and studied it closely. His expression softened. I remember this. A few relatives exchanged curious looks. My cousin Mark leaned forward. What ceremony was that? Before I could answer, Mom reached back into the box. There were papers with it. She pulled out a worn folder that had been tucked underneath the photograph. The room became quiet again. Inside were several documents, certificates, letters, official-looking records. Mom carefully placed them on the table. Sarah crossed her arms. This doesn't prove anything. But her voice sounded less confident now. Dad picked up the first document. His eyes widened slightly. Rachel. I immediately knew what he was reading. I had forgotten those papers were even there. Years ago, after leaving military service, I had packed everything into storage and never looked at it again. The past had stayed in a box. Until now. Dad handed one document to Aunt Linda, then another to Uncle Robert. Within seconds, multiple relatives were reading. Questions started coming immediately. You never told us about this. When did this happen? What exactly were you doing all those years? I shifted uncomfortably. I hated being the center of attention. Sarah noticed, and somehow that seemed to frustrate her even more. Can somebody explain what we're looking at? She asked. Dad looked at her, then back at the documents. These are official commendations. The room went silent. Sarah's confident expression slipped slightly. Dad continued. Several of them. Mom opened another folder. More papers appeared. Recognition letters. Performance evaluations. Training records. The pile kept growing. Aunt Linda looked genuinely shocked. Rachel, why didn't you ever tell anyone? I shrugged. Nobody asked. That answer somehow surprised them even more. The truth was simple. I had never joined the military for attention. I never expected applause. And I definitely didn't want every family dinner turning into a discussion about my service. To me, it had simply been a chapter of my life. An important chapter. But still just one chapter. Dad sat back in his chair. You know, he said quietly, Rachel was always like this. Everyone looked at him. When she'd come home on leave, I'd ask what she was doing. He smiled slightly. She'd tell me everything was fine. Several relatives laughed. Dad nodded. That's it. Just fine. Mom smiled. Meanwhile, she'd spend 2 hours asking everyone else how they were doing. I looked away, embarrassed. Sarah remained silent. For the first time all afternoon, she didn't seem to know what to say. Then Uncle Robert picked up another document. This says leadership recognition.
He looked at me.
You are leading people? I nodded.
For a while.
A while, he repeated. The document clearly showed several years. The room grew more interested with every new discovery. Mom found another envelope tucked inside the folder. Inside were photographs. More photographs. One showed me participating in a large training exercise. Another showed a formal ceremony. A third showed a group photo with dozens of personnel. Every picture revealed another piece of a story I had never shared. Sarah stared at them one by one. The smile she'd worn earlier had completely vanished. Dad folded his hands. I always wondered why you never talked about any of this. I thought for a moment, then answered honestly. Because the people I respected most never talked about themselves. The room became quiet again. That answer seemed to land differently. Several relatives nodded. Even Mom looked emotional. Then Aunt Linda uncovered something buried beneath the photographs. A sealed envelope. Different from everything else. Older. Yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front immediately caught my attention. Because I recognized it. I hadn't seen that handwriting in years. My stomach tightened. Dad noticed my reaction. What is it? I slowly leaned forward. I know who wrote that. The room became silent once more. Sarah looked between me and the envelope. What is it? I didn't answer immediately, because suddenly I remembered exactly where it had come from, and exactly who had written it. Dad carefully picked up the envelope. The seal had never been broken. Not once. Not in all these years. Everyone watched as he turned it over in his hands.
Then he looked at me.
Should we open it? I stared at the familiar handwriting for several seconds, then slowly nodded. Yes. Dad slid a finger beneath the seal. The entire room held its breath, because whatever was inside that letter had remained hidden for years. And something told me it was about to change the way my family saw me forever. The room was completely silent. Dad held the envelope carefully, almost as if he was afraid it might fall apart in his hands. The paper looked old. Much older than anything else we had found in the box. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not Mom. Not my relatives. Not even Sarah. Everyone was waiting. Dad slowly unfolded the letter and adjusted his glasses. Then he began reading. To whom it may concern. My name is Colonel Michael Harrison. The room immediately grew still. Several relatives exchanged glances. Dad continued. I am writing this letter regarding Sergeant Rachel Daniels. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard that title associated with my name in years. During my career, I worked with thousands of service members. Only a small number left a lasting impression. Rachel Daniels was one of them. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their drinks. The entire room seemed frozen. Dad kept reading. Most people measure leadership by rank. I measure leadership by character. When situations became difficult, Rachel remained calm. When others sought recognition, Rachel focused on solutions. When people needed help, she showed up. I lowered my eyes. The memories were coming back now. Faces. Places. Conversations. Mom quietly reached for my hand. Dad continued. Throughout her service, Rachel consistently placed others ahead of herself. She never chased praise. She never sought attention. She simply did the work. Aunt Linda wiped her eyes. Across the table, Sarah stared at the floor. The confident woman who had mocked me an hour earlier was gone.
Dad turned the page.
There is one thing I learned about Rachel that should be remembered. The strongest people are often the quietest. The room remained silent. Many individuals talk about integrity. Rachel practiced it. Many individuals talk about sacrifice. Rachel lived it. I could barely breathe. Not because of pride. Because I had completely forgotten this letter existed. Years ago, when Colonel Harrison gave it to me, I had thanked him and placed it in storage. I never expected anyone else to read it. Dad continued. There were countless moments where Rachel could have taken credit. Instead, She made sure others received recognition. She helped younger personnel succeed. She solved problems without seeking applause. And she demonstrated the kind of leadership that cannot be taught. Several relatives looked toward me with expressions I had never seen before. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. That felt strange, because respect was never what I had been looking for. The letter wasn't finished. Dad's voice softened as he reached the final page. If Rachel is ever questioned regarding her service, let this letter serve as my answer. I would trust her judgment, character, and leadership without hesitation. The uniform never defined her. The person inside it did. The room became completely silent. Dad lowered the paper. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Mom quietly wiped away a tear. Oh, Rachel.
I didn't know what to say.
For years, I had gone out of my way to avoid conversations like this. Now there was nowhere to hide. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes were fixed on the photograph still sitting in the center of the table. The same photograph she had dismissed earlier. The same photograph that had changed everything. I didn't know, she said quietly. Nobody responded.
She looked at me.
For the first time all afternoon, there was no arrogance in her voice. No sarcasm. No laughter. Only regret. I honestly didn't know. I studied her for a moment. Part of me wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to remind her exactly what she had said. But another part of me remembered something important. People often judge what they don't understand. And Sarah had spent years confusing silence with weakness. Finally, I shrugged gently. That's because I never talked about it. Sarah looked down. I thought if it was important, you would have said something. I smiled slightly. If I spent my life talking about what I did years ago, then maybe I didn't learn much from it. The room became quiet again. Then Dad leaned back in his chair. You know, he said, looking around the table, there's a lesson here. Everyone listened. Dad pointed toward the photograph. Most people spend their lives trying to look important. Then he pointed toward me. Rachel never cared about looking important.
His voice softened.
She cared about being useful. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. The evidence was sitting right there on the table. The photograph. The documents. The letter. Years of truth hidden inside a forgotten box. Sarah slowly stood. Then, to everyone's surprise, she walked around the table toward me. I owe you an apology. The room remained silent. She took a deep breath. I'm sorry. No excuses. No explanations. Just those 2 words. And somehow that was enough. A weight I hadn't realized I was carrying suddenly disappeared. Later that evening, as the party began winding down, I picked up the photograph and carefully returned it to the box. Dad noticed. You're putting it away? I smiled. Of course.
Why?
I looked at the picture one last time, then closed the lid, because that photograph didn't change who I was. Dad smiled. And for the first time all day, so did Sarah. I carried the box back toward the attic. Not because the story was over, but because it had finally been understood. That photograph didn't make me a soldier. It simply revealed who I had been all along.